Hello BookTube, welcome back to my 2026 library tour. In this episode, I'm going to be finishing off this small bookcase that really should be in the little manga room. Again, the works of history on this shelf are from all over the place. So let's get started. Beginning once again with American or U.S. history. This vast southern empire, slaveholders at the helm of American foreign policy by Matthew Karp. So this is a study of how the planter class of the U.S. South dominated the government for much of the period leading up to the Civil War. And it focuses a lot on their foreign policy goals, which, if I remember correctly, included like adding or buying Cuba from Spain, something with Brazil, supporting various attempts by American net jobs to conquer various or Central American states, that sort of thing. When I read it well over 10 years ago now, I rather enjoyed it, or I think it might have been about 10 years ago. I really enjoyed it. I wanted to add it to my collection, although I have not reread it, which is probably something I wish I could get about correcting, but at the moment I'm really not all that interested in reading history. So the next two books are about the end of the Ottoman Empire, starting with The Fall of the Ottomans, The Great War in the Middle East, 1914 to 1920, by Eugene Rogan. So this is the story of the Ottoman Empire in World War I and its ultimate defeat and a reorganization into the Republic of Turkey under Ataturk. I wish there was more attention paid to the Ottomans in this book and a little less to the British, because most of the sources, most of the attention is focused on the British side of things and not so much on the Turkish or Ottoman side of things. And that made me wonder, are Turkish sources easily available, or is it inaccessible for non-Turkish scholars? But I'm like, that was something that I definitely noticed was lacking, was there didn't seem to be much in the way of Turkish sources. The Last Days of the Ottoman Empire by Ryan Gingerus. So this is a book in a similar vein, although the story opens much earlier, because the Ottoman Empire was a state in decline for a very long time. Although I think this book really opens up with the last attempts at reform before the First World War. I did not get into this book. I'm not entirely sure why. Probably would like to revisit it some time. So the next book, excuse me, I have not read is Empire of Horses, The First Nomadic Civilization and the Making of China by John Mann. And Genghis Khan and the Making of the Modern World by Jack Rutherford. This is in part a biography of Genghis Khan, who was one of the great conquerors, and a little bit of history of the Mongols. I did not particularly get on with this book. Next is Dictatorland, The Men Who Stole Africa by Paul Kenyon. This is a look at the various African dictators and how they came to power and what how much they stole from their countries and what resources they were focused on. This is a really, really good book. I really enjoyed it, and there was quite a bit of humor in the book as well, in spite of or despite all of the brutality. A History of South Africa by Frank Welsh. So this is the only history of South Africa I have in my collection, and I read it about a decade ago and rather liked it, so I wanted to have it in my collection. Lives of the Ancient Egyptians by Toby Wilkinson. This is basically just a dictionary of ancient Egyptians and what we know about them. Did not particularly like this when I tried it. In the land, excuse me, in the Land of a Thousand Gods, A History of Asia Minor and the Ancient World by Christian Merrick, in collaboration with Peter Frey, and translated from, I think, the German by Stephen Rindel. So this is a massive book on ancient Anatolia in the ancient world, from prehistory up through Roman domination. It's a very hit or miss book. I tried to read it a few years ago. I picked it up from Princeton during one of their 75% off sales, and I rather like the part that's about the Hittites, but there's quite a lot of it that loses me. In Search of the Phoenicians by Josephine Quinn. So, this, excuse me, this is a history of the Phoenicians, or the peoples who lived in what has come to be called Phoenicia. The people themselves did not think of themselves as a single people, but as the residents or the people of the various city-states. And Josephine Quinn goes to show that and to show some of that history, as well as how the idea of Phoenician came to be, both in the ancient world as well as in the more modern world. Well, this is a fairly interesting book, pretty academic. It is from Princeton University Press, and I picked it up during one of their sales. 1177 BC, The Year Civilization Collapsed by Eric H. Klein. So in addition to writing about archaeology, Klein also has a few books about the ancient world. Particularly, there is a duology called 1177 and After 1177 that looks at the Bronze Age collapse. This book looks at the late Bronze Age and ultimately looks at various theories as to how things collapse, how all of these great states like ancient Egypt and Babylon and the Hittites, kind of how they fell or were greatly weakened, and how a lot of these satellite states or subject states to them were wiped out. And his conclusion is that it was a combination of climate change and other things. So the history part of it I remember rather fondly, but the science part, the investigation part, I wasn't as keen on. I don't think he did as well of a job on that. So the next three books are by Tom Holland, the historian, not the actor. And I have them actually in, I think, release date order. So first up is Persian Fire, the First World Empire and the Battle for the West. Of course, by Tom Holland. So this is a history of the Persian Wars, a war waged between the Greek city-states and the Persian Empire over the course of about a century or two. I don't remember if I've ever read this outside of giving it an attempt that I bailed on. I just don't remember, but I remember not getting on with this book. I did read Dynasty, The Rise and Fall of the House of Caesar. So this is the story of the Julio-Claudian dynasty, the first dynasty of emperors that dominated the Roman Empire once Augustus became sole dictator, monarch, whatever the hell he was. So the one thing about this book that I noted, and that I think is largely why I really don't like it, is that I realized in reading this book that a lot of the sources, that the textual sources that have come down to us, are basically the National Enquirer. It's basically history by tabloid. Yes, the Roman writers and historians are a lot better writers, but it's still basically the same thing. And I'm thinking, how do we know they're telling the truth? How do we know these sources are telling the truth? And I thought Tom Holland was more obviously non-critical in how he presented this story. And that really annoyed me. Now, Holland is a more popular historian, and I'm not telling, and so his focus perhaps is more on telling a good story rather than, challenging and questioning the sources. But I didn't like it. And so I've never gotten to his book, Dominion, The Making of the Western Mind, which I picked this book up and I was initially interested in it because I was for a while interested in the history of conversion of the Roman Empire to Christianity. There was a fantasy story I wanted to write in which a priest of a god whose worship was in the process of being abolished because the empire was converting to a new religion. And so this priest was going to go in search of what happened to his god. And I never got around to writing that story. And I never really got around to doing much of the research on that. Even though another book is about to come out that I think does a bit better job, because that's actually the focus. But this book is more, I think, in probably too short a space, a history of Christian influence on the West. Or at least that's what I've gathered from people who have read the book and have reviewed it on BookTube. The Last Pharaohs, Egypt Under the Ptolemies, 305 to 30 BC by J.G. Manning. Picked this up from Princeton, I think, during one of their sales. I'm also very interested in the Ptolemies, although this is not necessarily the best book for that. A little too academic if memory serves. A History of Crete by Chris Morey. Picked this up from University of Chicago Press during one of their big sales. Have not read it. The Darkening Age, The Christian Destruction of the Classical World by Catherine Nixie. So, to return to that story that I wanted to write, this book is certainly more inspiration fuel for that, because The Darkening Age is about the Christianization of the Roman Empire and the subsequent destruction before and after of the pagan temples and things that people and places and thoughts that were not conducive to Christianity. Empires of the Week, the real story of European expansion and the creation of the New World Order by J.C. Sharman. So this is a study of how initially during the early days of colonialism in empire, the European states were relatively weaker against the native or indigenous states that they came up against. Say, for example, the Spanish against the Aztecs or the Inca. Although, of course, in those cases, it was a significant amount of luck. That saw the Spanish conquering both states. But the real sort of the focus is on more like Africa, where in Asia, where Europeans were a lot more differential, a lot more cautious until the 19th century. So I think I remember being fairly interesting, but a bit academic. But it has been a while since I've read it. The New Lefts, The Making of Radical Tradition by Terence Renaud. So I picked this up from a Yale University Press sale. Have not read it. From a University of Chicago Press sale, Backpack Ambassadors, How Youth Travel Integrated Europe by Richard Ivan Jobs. Have not read it. From the University of Chicago Press sale, The Peace That Never Was, A History of the League of Nations by Ruth Hennig. Have not read it. The Dark Queens by Shelley... The Dark Queens by Shelley Puhak. So this is a joint biography of two early French queens, Brunhild and Fredegund, who were competing sister-in-laws during the Merovingian era of French history. This is a pretty good book. It reads very much like a novel, although it's not, but I really enjoyed it. And finally, The Burgundians, A Vanished Empire, A History of 1,111 Years and One Day by Bart van Loo, translated from, I think, the Dutch by Nancy Forrest Flyer. Have not gotten around to this yet, even though I have been meaning to for years, because I actually have a bookmark in here. So that booktube concludes this bookcase. I will be starting tomorrow on the next bookcase. And so from here on out, there's going to be a bit more organization on the books. Although in some cases there might be a little bit of wonkiness, because one day I'm going to do the end shelves of the big bookcase that I'm using for history. But that's a few episodes away. So until I see you next time, BookTube, thank you and have a great morning.